Chapter 5 is all about performance appraisal. Those of you that are working will probably have come across having an appraisal at some point with your boss. What we are particularly interested in this chapter is why we have appraisals and how we should make sure that they are run properly. So, first of all then, what exactly do we mean by a performance appraisal? Most of you, if you've had an appraisal, will appreciate it means that you sit down with your boss and you have some kind of appraisal interview. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But the idea behind an appraisal then is you get some feedback on how you are doing. Now, as I say, lots of students think that the only way that this ever happens is when they sit down and they have their 6-monthly or yearly interview with the manager. But actually, that's not what appraisal actually means. Technically, appraisal, you can see, is an ongoing process. So it could be once every 6 months, but it can be more frequent than that. What happens as part of this appraisal? We are basically looking at establishing some objectives. In the last chapter, in chapter 4, we talked about objectives and we said that they should be SMART. If you remember, we said they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and timed. And the idea behind an objective is to give the employee, the worker, something to aim for, something to try and achieve. So, during the performance appraisal interview, this is one of the main times when we actually give the employee a target to try and achieve. So the idea behind this then is we need to have some system inside the company so that employees are regularly given some feedback on how they are doing and given some objectives to move them forward. Now, let's be honest about this. In lots of companies, this doesn't actually happen. I have worked for companies where they don't do formal appraisals. What you could have instead is an informal appraisal system. Again, at a regular interval, once every 2 months, 3 months, you just sit down with the boss and you have a chat with them about how you're getting on. Doesn't matter if it's formal or informal. Doesn't matter if it's a chat or if it's actually a proper interview. The key thing is that we need to go through this process of reviewing how the worker is doing, then giving them some feedback on their performance, and then thinking where they're going to go next. It ties in very much with what we were doing in chapter 4, when we were talking about things like personal development plans, because if the worker feels that they just go in and they do the same thing every day, every month, every year, and they feel they're not really getting anywhere, then some workers will become very demotivated and will want to leave. So an appraisal system is a way that you can give them some feedback. Hopefully, if they've got any problems, they can be fixed. Then we can move the employee forward so that the employee is still happy working for the organisation. So as I say, with appraisals, you don't need to have anything fancy. It doesn't need to be a formal interview, but you do need some way that the manager is regularly going to give some feedback to the employee. A formal system simply forces them to do it by making it something that they have to do. Every 6 months, everybody has to have an appraisal. But if you thought the manager was going to do it anyway, and find the time to sit down with each individual on a regular basis, then you wouldn't need a formal system. Formal systems simply force people to do it. So, appraisals then are ongoing. The key thing, as we've already said, is it's there to establish what you're going to do in the future and also to provide feedback on what's happened. And as I say, it doesn't have to be an interview, it could simply be being a chat. You can also, of course, be appraised on a regular basis just by the boss reviewing what you have done and then talking to you about it. So, I gave you a task. Here is how you performed on that task. You did this bit particularly well. That bit is not so good and I think you need to do it again, and this is how I would like you to do it, you are still, in effect, getting appraised because you're getting some feedback and you can think about what you're then going to do. So, remember, at work, when you are talking to your boss, if you're getting any feedback at all, then you are being appraised. Most of us, however, will also have an appraisal interview. It might be a very formal one. It might be, as I said, a very informal one. So, the appraisal interview. We have a chance to talk about the past, the present, and the future. How have you done in the last 6 months? What are you working on at the moment? What would you like to be working on in the future? So you can see the link here with our personal development plan. If you have a good appraisal, so if you have an effective appraisal interview, hopefully one of the things that will come out is, what do we want you to achieve for the next 6 months, for the next year, for the next 2 weeks? So what kind of objectives do we want? Again, giving the employee something to aim towards, something to work towards. That will, of course, fit in with something that we have already mentioned, which is some kind of development plan. We are going to send you on some courses in the next 6 weeks, in the next 3 months, so that you can develop these skills. Development doesn't have to be through going on courses. It could also be, I am going to assign you this project to do, and you will develop some new skills as part of this project. I am going to put you in charge of this particular team of people working on something. I'm going to give you this particular task, which again will give you some different skills and develop what you are doing. But again, the idea is there should really be some kind of meeting where you can sit down and you can talk about these things. There will hopefully be some kind of discussion, some kind of agreement about whether there is going to be a reward or a bonus for meeting the previous time's targets. We will talk more about that when we talk about motivation a little bit later on in the course. But if you give people some objectives, it's a sensible thing to do to reward them once they've met them. We do have a slight issue with that one, and we will see that again a little bit later on. But the idea behind the bonuses is, I gave you a target, you have met it. I gave you an objective, you have achieved it. So therefore there is a reward. You've earned that reward, now let's talk about what your net objectives are. Documentation. Very, very important. And this is one of the key differences between a formal and an informal appraisal system. In an informal appraisal system, we will have a chat and that'll be the end of it. In a formal appraisal system, we will have a chat and then the manager will write up what we have discussed. Often they do that as part of the meeting so that at the end the manager can sign it and so can the worker. So we are both agreeing this is what's going to come next. And it forms a key part of lots of companies' HR. So they have a record of what's being discussed, how people are improving, what courses they've done, what development they are doing, what bonuses have been agreed with them. And it may also be used if you are in a situation where various employees get graded. So in other words, there might be various levels of employee, from the lowest up to the highest. Appraisal systems could be used as part of the grading system. We are happy with your progress, so we are going to upgrade you. We're going to move you up in terms of seniority, in terms of pay, in terms of responsibility. So there's lots of different things that could come into an appraisal interview. So why are they important? Well, hopefully we've already discussed and we've talked about some of the reasons they're important for the employer and for the employee. But just to reiterate, just to go through those again, communication. It's one of the few times when you get a chance to sit and talk with your manager on your own, and in effect, you both have to listen to each other. So it's a good way that the worker can get some feedback on how they're doing, but it's also an opportunity for the manager to find out what the worker is thinking. So it's a good chance to communicate. Feedback for staff is always important. If you have a member of staff who is not performing particularly well, then you need to tell them, and then you need to work together to try and improve things. So feedback on if they're doing poorly. Obviously, it's just as important to give them feedback if they are doing well, so that you recognise that they are doing well. We will talk about that again when we get to chapter 6. The idea that workers respond to having their hard work recognised by the management. And finally, it could allow the managers to have improved control over the workers. Now, what that means is the manager wants the worker to do certain tasks. The manager wants the worker to do things in a particular way. At the appraisal interview, you can make sure that the work has been done the way that you wanted it to and discuss this with the worker. If they have not been doing it the way that you want them to, you can hopefully try and change the way they do it so it's the way that you expect it to be. So again, it gives you a regular meeting so that you can talk to the worker about any problems that they are having, about any difficulties with the way they're actually carrying out their jobs. So you can see it's important for both the worker and the manager. Now, it's a control system, and a control system means it's a way of making sure that good workers are encouraged, and it's a way of making sure that bad workers are improved or got rid of. So, any kind of control system, we can use the acronym, the initials TARA, T-A-R-A. We set people targets. We have already seen those when we talked about objectives. And remember, objectives, targets should be SMART. That means that we can come along when we have our next appraisal, in 6 months, in 1 year, in 2 years, whenever it happens to be, when we come along and have our next appraisal, we can see what has actually been achieved. So, there was your target, there were your objectives, here is what you have actually achieved, and there's a difference between the two. We can review them, so that's where we work out that this difference has taken place, and finally we take some action. If there is a problem, the manager and the employee work together to find a solution. Now, those of you that are doing paper F2, or those of you that have done any management accounts, will recognise that is exactly the same as when you do variances. A standard cost is a target. You then look at what actually happened. So you look at standard cost or a budget, compare it with what actually happened, that's your review, and then you take action. If it's an adverse variance, you fix it. If it's a favourable variance, you find out why and you do it again. It's exactly the same with an appraisal. Here is your target, here is your objective, here is your actual, there is a difference, what are we going to do to solve that? So they are a key point, they're a key part in trying to make sure that workers do what they are supposed to. So poor workers, we try and improve or we get rid of them. Good workers, we try and keep moving them on and keep them enthusiastic. So when we've got appraisals, how are we going to work out whether somebody's done a good job? Objectives. We've mentioned objectives over and over and over again in the last couple of chapters. But that's not the only way that we can talk about appraising somebody's performance. We might want to get some feedback from customers. Now, we've got internal customers and external customers. Internal customers will be people inside the company. They will be people usually in other departments that we have to work with. So let's say, for example, that you are in the finance department of an organisation and you regularly have to contact people in other departments, perhaps to collect figures from them so that you can prepare some accounts at the end of each month, perhaps to explain what the results mean. So every month you send out, you collect all the information from departments, you prepare a report that says how everybody has done, you send it out to all the managers of the departments, and then if they've got any questions, they ask you about it. They would be internal customers. Any time where you are preparing something for somebody else inside the company. Now that could be very, very important, because obviously if you are looking after other people inside the company, you are helping them to do their jobs. You're helping them to achieve their objectives, and that could be a key thing. On the other hand, of course, when we talk about customers, what we usually mean are external customers, people outside the organisation. Now again, this will not be appropriate for every member of staff in your organisation. Some of them never deal with anybody outside the organisation, but many of them will do. They will answer telephone queries from members of the public, answering questions and inquiries from customers. How do they deal with them? Are they helpful? Are they polite? Do customers like them? Now remember that the view of your external customers is incredibly important to a company. So if you have a member of staff who is not very good at dealing with external customers, it can have a very damaging impact on your organisation. So if you have somebody who deals with customers regularly, they are often referred to as the frontline staff, because they deal directly with customers. That might be one of the most important parts of the appraisal. How do you deal with customers? If you work in a large organisation, not only will you have internal customers, but you may well also spend a lot of time working with your colleagues. So perhaps it's useful to get feedback from them as well. So feedback from your colleagues, what would they talk about? They would probably talk about things like, are you helpful? Are you reliable? If there is a deadline that needs meeting for somebody else's project, are you happy to go along and help them out? Or on the other hand, is your attitude, well, it's your project and you deal with it? So these are the kind of things that, again, might be very useful as far as an organisation is concerned. Self-appraisal. Self-appraisal is actually notoriously difficult to do. In fact, it's very difficult to do it properly. But self-appraisal means exactly what it sounds like. The idea is that we appraise our own abilities. The big problem with self-appraisal is that people tend to be either too harsh on themselves, and they say that they are terrible, or they're too easy on themselves and they say they are brilliant. It's actually very difficult to be fair when you're actually doing your own appraisal. But self-appraisal is quite a valuable one, because after all, the best person to listen to if you have to accept that there is a problem that needs fixing is actually yourself. If other people say that there's a problem, you may not take any notice. But if you come up with it yourself, then obviously you are more likely to change whatever needs fixing. It could be things such as the work that we've got through. That might be appropriate, particularly if you're something like in a manufacturing company. The easiest way to appraise your ability could simply be to say, how much have you manufactured? And it could be things like training courses. So we said that you were going to attend these training courses, you have attended them, you've done these exams, you've passed this particular thing, you've now got these skills. You can put all of those together and come up with what is called 360-degree appraisal. 360-degree appraisal means that you are appraised by your colleagues. But you are also going to be appraised by your manager. If you are a senior person, if you are already a manager, you can also be appraised by the people who you are managing, referred to as your subordinates. so the people who work for you. And you get appraised by all of these different groups. Now, what is good about 360-degree appraisal? Well, the obvious thing is you are getting a very, very rounded picture of what the member of staff is like. So, the way that a manager looks at you may be very different to the way your colleagues look at you, may be very different to the way your subordinates look at you. So if you do 360-degree appraisal, you can actually look at everything. That will become important again when we start talking about managing people. Because one of the most important things if you are a manager when you're looking after staff is you have got your own tasks to do. That's what your boss will look at. Did you get all your tasks done? But as a manager, another key thing is keeping your subordinates happy, keeping the people who work for you happy. So it would be useful to have their feedback so that you know whether you're doing a good job. And obviously, if you're a senior person, you're going to be working with other senior people. So it's important that we think what your colleagues are looking at as well. So there are a number of different types of way that we might appraise somebody. 360-degree appraisal is very, very useful. Are there any problems with it? Well, the obvious ones are it's going to take a long time. Imagine that you have to have a report from each of these people. So every time we want to do an appraisal, we need a report from somebody's manager, somebody's subordinates, and somebody's colleagues. We need an awful lot of information to do the appraisal. So the first problem with 360-degree appraisals is they take a long time. The second problem with 360-degree appraisals is that one group of people might say you're very good, and another group of people might say that you're actually very poor. So your colleagues might think you are great, but the people that you manage might hate you. So you can get conflicting appraisals because you're looking from different points of view. But 360-degree appraisals are becoming more and more popular because they give you such a well-rounded view of the person. So, if we're going to have any kind of appraisal, as I say, the appraisal process can be anything you want it to be. It could be your boss coming up to you and just talking about one task. It could be your boss having a cup of coffee with you in the kitchen and just having a chat. One of the companies that I used to work for, I had an appraisal every 6 months, which basically involved going for a beer, not with my boss, but with one of the senior people in the organisation. And my entire appraisal interview usually lasted about half an hour, of which usually about 1.5 minutes was the appraisal, and then the other 28.5 minutes were having a beer. So the appraisal usually went, how do you think this term has gone? I would say, I think it's gone okay. What do you think? And the boss would say, yes, we're quite happy. What do you want to drink? And that was it. Now, that worked for me because I have been a lecturer for a number of years. I would suggest that for a junior member of staff who perhaps has only been working for 6 months, that would not be appropriate. But for somebody who's been working for 10 years, that's probably absolutely fine, unless there is a problem. So unless there is actually an issue that needs resolving. So whatever kind of appraisal process you have, we need to appraise and assess whether that entire process is good. So in one job I had, we basically went to the pub and we had a beer. In another organisation I worked at, every 6 months we actually had a formal interview with our bosses where there were a lot of reports that were gathered from various people we had worked with, colleagues, subordinates, managers, even sometimes from customers. They were all put together and we went through a formal process and the manager ticked off each item as we went through it. It took probably about an hour every 6 months. Completely different. At the end of it, we both had to agree what the objectives would be for the next year, the next 6 months rather. We had to both sign it. Very different to just having a chat and having a beer, where there was no paperwork whatsoever. Which of those two systems, which of those two processes is better? And the short answer is neither of them is better, neither of them is worse. They're just different, as long as they work for the organisation. as long as they work for the employer and for the individual, to be honest, it doesn't really matter what kind of system you have, whether it's informal, a chat, or whether it's formal and heavily documented. So, we do need a way of working out if our appraisal process is any good or not. How can we do that? Well, one thing that we could do is we could see, do more people take up training courses? If the answer is yes, it could very well indicate that our appraisal system is working, it's being effective, because people realise that they want to develop more skills. We could look at employee satisfaction and employee effectiveness. If we spend the time with each individual worker to say, this is what you are good at, and we're really pleased about that, but this is what you need to improve, and we will help you to improve, then the workers should become more effective. They should become better at their jobs. And as they become better at their jobs, they should enjoy it more, so the satisfaction should go up. Feedback from employees is obviously going to be one. So if your employees are happier, then it's a good sign that your appraisal process is working. If you have spent a lot of money designing an appraisal process, and by designing an appraisal process you decide what will be discussed, what reports will you collect before the meeting, what bits of paper will you sign, it's a long and drawn out process, it's very expensive. Not only that, but a formal system like the one that I mentioned in an organisation that I worked for where we had these regular meetings, it takes up an awful lot of everybody's time on a regular basis. It's a complete and utter waste of money unless you are getting something valuable out of it. So, training, satisfaction, effectiveness, feedback from employees. What about things like internal recruitment? Internal recruitment, remember, is things like promotions. If the appraisal system is working well, we will be able to identify the people who should be promoted, because we will recognise their strengths. When we promote them, they will be good at their new job. Now, if that's not happening, if people are not being promoted, or when they are promoted they turn out that they're not very good, that could be a fault of the appraisal process. We're recognising the wrong people. Obviously, as accountants, you would like to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis. The costs are difficult to work out because a lot of them are time. How long does this take? The benefits, to be honest, are even harder to work out. So that one may work, but it probably will be tricky. Perhaps an easier one to look at is staff turnover. If people are happy at work, they will stay. And an appraisal system is part of keeping staff happy, because you recognise what they're good at. You promote them if they are good, so they feel they are getting on. If there is a problem, you help them to fix it, so they won't leave because they're unhappy. So appraisal systems could well benefit your staff turnover. It could reduce it because staff are happy where they are. Now, if you are going to have an appraisal system, again, whatever kind it is, whether it's meeting for a chat over a cup of coffee, or whether it's having a formal sit-down interview, you need to make sure that they are held frequently. Now, how often is frequent? How often do you need to meet? It will depend on the seniority of the person, and it will depend on the experience. Those are both the employees. Generally speaking, the more inexperienced you are, so the less experience you have and the more junior you are, you should be appraised more regularly. Because often when you've got less experience, when you are new, that's when you will make more mistakes. That's when we can help you the most. So we might have an appraisal maybe every 3 months, maybe every 6 months. If you've been doing a job for 10, 15, 20 years, probably you only need an appraisal maybe once every year. It may even be less than that. So the idea is, I can't tell you How frequently appraisals should be, it depends on the circumstances. Appraisals should also be factual. Now, what that means is that they should not be based on opinions. It should make no difference whatsoever whether the manager likes you or whether the manager hates you as to what your appraisal is like. It should be based on facts. So facts, it makes no difference whether the manager likes you or not. So, did you attend these training courses? What was the amount of work that you produced? Did you pass your exams? These are all facts that you either say, yes, you did these things, so you've done well, or no, you didn't, so you haven't done as well. The manager's opinion doesn't make any difference. They should be fair, particularly, as we said earlier, when we're setting objectives. So it would not be fair for one person to have a very easy set of objectives to achieve, so a set of objectives that they won't have to work very hard to achieve, and another person in the same department to have a set of objectives that would be very difficult to achieve. So they should be fair. Everybody should be treated in the same way. And finally, they need to be firm. And what we mean by firm is that we need to criticise the worker if it is appropriate. You can't simply have an appraisal and say everything is fine, unless, of course, everything is fine, which is very unlikely. If there is a problem, you need to tell the worker. Now, some managers don't really like doing this. Some employees don't like doing it because they feel they're being criticised. And the answer is yes, the employee is being criticised, but they're being told what they're doing badly so that they can improve it. It's a positive thing. If nobody ever told you that you were doing something wrong, you would never change it. You would carry on doing it wrong. So the idea is that we should try and get people to improve. So if there is a problem, we should tell them. Remember, however, we need to be fair with people. We shouldn't criticise them too much. We shouldn't find loads of things to criticise. We need to find the major things and criticise those. But also, if we are going to criticise something and say what's wrong, we also have to make sure that we're going to say what's right and how it should be fixed. There is no point in having an appraisal where you simply say, you are doing this badly. What you need to do is to say, you are doing this badly. This is how I know. This is the proof. This is the facts that I have that show me that you're doing something badly. And now let's work together to see how we're going to improve this. So you turn the whole thing into a very positive experience rather than a negative one. Now, appraisals are very, very good in theory because they will hopefully keep improving the performance of the employee. So the employee gets better, the employee does more interesting things, the department gets more done, the company is better, the organisation does better. So everybody should win. The trouble is that often appraisals are not that good. There are lots of barriers to effective appraisals. So in other words, there's lots of reasons why appraisals do not go as well as they should do. Now, some of the barriers that we've got, lack of structure. You get that particularly if you have an informal appraisal. So if the company deliberately just sits down with you and has a chat, then often things will get missed out. So one of the reasons why some particularly large organisations like to have a formal system of appraisals is it forces the manager and the employee to do certain things, to talk about certain issues, and they have to cover them. So they have to talk about the strengths, they have to talk about the weaknesses, they have to talk about the training that will be done for the next 6 months, they have to talk about the objectives. So they force people to talk about everything. If they are not very well structured, what that means is they can just degenerate into just a rambling conversation. And at the end of it, the employee really doesn't know whether it was a good appraisal or not. And of course, there may be some things missed out. So lack of structure is a barrier to having an effective appraisal. Lack of preparation. Now, managers are busy. We all know that. It takes time to prepare properly for an appraisal. It takes time for the manager to prepare properly for an appraisal. There is no point in you going through an appraisal, which, remember, for you might only be once a year, and you turn up for your appraisal and it's obvious that the manager is just now, for the first time, looking at all the reports that are coming from various people. So they haven't really had time in their own mind to put them together, to think, do these demonstrate a pattern which shows you are good at something? Do these put together have a pattern which shows that you're weak at something? If they're just looking at them for the first time, the chances are that the appraisal won't be particularly good, because the manager hasn't had a chance to think about what's the key things that they will need to talk about. So, one of the things that companies forget is they set aside enough time to have the appraisal interviews, but they should also set aside enough time for the manager to prepare for it properly. Probably, and this is like a rough guess, for every hour that you are spending appraising somebody, I would suspect that you need at least 30 minutes to prepare properly for that. Some people would probably say you need even longer. So you need to build that into the manager's time so that they've got time to do it properly. One of the big barriers is fear of being judged. Now, we said a little bit earlier that appraisals should be firm. The manager should be prepared to criticise if something is wrong. Well, the other side of that is the employee must be not so worried about being criticised that as soon as somebody starts saying something negative, they get very defensive. So the fear of being judged. People don't like being told that they're not very good at something. We've already said the big problem is that if you're not told that you're doing something wrong, you won't ever improve. So with appraisals, yes, we will judge you. We will tell you what's good, and if we tell you what's wrong, it's because we want to improve it somehow. Lack of commitment. In some particularly large organisations, you may come across a manager who is doing appraisals simply because they have to. So the manager comes and sits in the appraisal to give an appraisal for an employee, and they don't really care. They are only doing it because they've been told to do it by, for example, the Human Resources Department. Now, if they don't really care, the appraisal won't be very useful. The employee will not really benefit from it because the manager isn't taking it very seriously. That can be a problem in again, as I say, in large organisations. Because in large organisations, they often have formal appraisal systems, and some managers may not agree with the way that things are being done. So, unfortunately, whether they agree with it or not, they've got to do it properly. It's unfair on the employee if they don't do it properly. Lack of understanding. What does an appraisal actually mean? Well, again, in some organisations, people won't really understand what it's supposed to be doing. Isn't an appraisal just a chance for the manager to criticise me? Or isn't an appraisal simply where the manager tells me that I'm going to get a reward, I'm going to get a bonus? So it may well be that the employees don't really understand what's going on. And if they don't really understand what's going on, then they probably won't get as much out of it. Lack of follow-up. You have your appraisal. I sit down with you, I'm your manager, I sit down with you and I say, here is something that is a weakness, and we, between us, need to fix it. You and I come up with a way together that we're going to fix this weakness. And then, because I am so busy, I never get in contact with you to find out whether you did whatever we had decided you were going to do to fix the weakness. So in other words, there is no follow-up. You should do this to improve, and I never check. So the first time that I'm going to know whether you improved or not is in a year's time when I see you for your next appraisal. Now, if you haven't improved, that's a year that's wasted. So follow up. If I give you some things to do to improve, I should keep coming back and checking that you are doing them and checking that you are improving. Otherwise, again, it's a pointless exercise. Lack of opportunity to feed back to the management. Now, what that is talking about is that in certain appraisal interviews, particularly the ones that get mentioned in the exam, because often they're not very good, what you might have is a manager who does what is called tells, and we will see this again a little bit later on in the course. The entire appraisal interview simply consists of the manager telling the employee what they think. So, I think this, I think that, and there is no listening going on. There is no feedback going on. So, in the exam, look for a manager that doesn't actually listen to what the employee is saying. There is no discussion. That's not a good appraisal. A good appraisal lets the worker put their own point of view forward. Finally, we have the idea of a bureaucratic system. A bureaucratic system simply means that there are lots and lots and lots of pieces of paper that we have to fill in. And so, unfortunately, most of the appraisal is taken up, or most of the preparation time, rather, is taken up in filling out bits of paper. Now, as I said to you a little bit earlier, one of the organisations that I worked for had a very formal appraisal scheme. It was a 360-degree appraisal. Every time you worked with a colleague, you had to write a little report. Every time you did a project for a manager, you wrote a report on the manager wrote a report on you. There were loads and loads of bits of paper. And the amount of time that it spent writing on these pieces of paper and then collecting them all, and then the manager reading all of them and finding out what's the most important bits, it took up an awful lot of time. Now, there is nothing wrong with that if that time is valuable, if it's time well spent, if it's helping the employee and if it's helping the company. The trouble is that in lots of organisations, the potential is for you to simply get lots and lots of bits of paper that take up everybody's time, and it's not really helping that much. So appraisals then are a key way of improving the performance of the people that we've got. So if we just remind ourselves the stage that we've got to by the end of that chapter, we selected the right people, and because they are the right people, we want to keep them. If they weren't the right people, we'd want to get rid of them again. So we spend a lot of time and money getting the right people. One of the things we need to do is we need to keep them. We need to get the most out of them, and we want them to stay in the organisation. How will we do that? Well, we get the most out of them by identifying what they are good at and what they are bad at. And then what they're good at, we try and encourage them to do more. What they're bad at, we send them on some training and development courses to try and fix those things. If they're good at something, we try and get them to develop those skills and to do more on them. So the idea is that we've recruited the right people. We're trying to get the most out of them so that the organisation benefits and the worker benefits because they feel they are getting somewhere and they are happier at work. And appraisals are a very big part of that. So as I said at the start of that chapter, whether you do a formal appraisal, you have an interview, you have lots of pieces of paper, you sign something at the end, or whether you have a very informal system where you basically just have a chat with your boss, it's vitally important in every organisation that you get some kind of appraisal from somebody, because otherwise you've got no idea how you are doing. You've got no idea if you're doing well, but even more importantly, you've got no idea if you're doing badly.